focus on was a lot around patience. It was very different, combining work life with home life, and not just work life, but where appropriate, partners home life, which can sometimes be a little bit frustrating. We have doorbells and deliveries to deal with now. We have caring, whether it's delivering food packages to people or childcare, and homeschooling, which for some of us has been an added joy to our day. So, you know, that's I think we've all kind of moved through this, and this is the reality of what our life is today, and maybe going forward, and really working towards embracing it. And I think, like many, we have certainly well and truly embraced many of this, and the type of things that we think about on a daily basis in terms of how we work within the organization, and how we make sure that Waracle still has the essence of what is Waracle to us is, you know, looking out for each other. So the wellness side of things, we're all in this together, but what in this means is quite different for a lot of people. Some people have gardens, some people don't, some people have children, they don't, they live alone, they live with family, and all of those kind of things are quite different pressures for people to deal with. We often talk about Waracle families. We have a Slack channel dedicated to this. And what's interesting for us is, as Waracle has entered our house, the reciprocals probably happened as well. And so we have had 3 o'clock daily story time for children, where Waracle children are reading to other Waracle children. We've had school discos. It's not unusual for Waracle children to be talking to other members of the Waracle team, and that's just a reality of our life as it stands at the moment. We absolutely over communicate. I think we were good at this before. We're masters at it now. Like many of you, we spend all day on video calls, and that's pretty exhausting, but we feel that reaching out has never been more important, or in a way more effective. And I'll come on to talk about what I think the biggest achievement for us has been, in terms of it's been quite a big leveler for the company. Trust and doing great work are incredibly important to us, and so we absolutely know that we have big responsibilities to our clients, to our business, and to our employees, and that is absolutely not changed. And I think what's come with it is shown just new opportunities that we can take along the way. And it is still important for us to have fun. So like many of you, we have quizzes, we have team takeovers, we have DJ lunch sets, lunchtime DJ sets, I should say. So lots of different things in terms of trying to keep everyone together and keep the essence of what is important to us. And as we go forward, just before I hand over to Joanna, I think I mentioned to you one of the biggest things I think we've achieved is it's been a great leveler for the company. So those that used to work in an office versus those that didn't, and how we take that forward, and how we keep working through things that are important to us in terms of valuing our staff contribution and the type of work that we deliver, the purpose of the type of work that we do, and how we work with others, and our vision to grow technology through digital, and how we can use this as an opportunity to keep growing. So that's kind of a real snapshot, very quick in terms of where we find ourselves. But what we wanted to do was engage with Joanna just to talk a little bit more in terms of some of the psychology around this, versus what's practically happening to us, is to maybe consider why it's happening to us. So we're delighted to be joined by Joanna today, so I'm happy to hand over to her now. And so, as I said, please take any questions that you've got, just add them to the chat, and we'll ask them of Joanna at the end, or of myself if you've got any questions about Waracle. So Joanna, I'll let you take over the screen if you can.
Great, thank you. Okay, there we go. See that okay? Perfect. Thank you. Thanks, Sharon. Well, hello, everybody. I'm really glad to be here talking about this afternoon. Shame about the pizza and beer, maybe this time. But yeah, hopefully again soon. This is a really broad and deep topic, and is obviously at the forefront of, I think, of a lot of people's minds at the moment. And Sharon's talked about how Waracle have been embracing change, probably as part of their culture for quite some time. But for some people, this is, I don't think it's new. Change is happening all the time, but the level of change that's been happening more recently is having quite a significant impact. So Sharon says, I'm going to talk a bit more around the psychology of that, and talk about the fear and freedom within it, of which there is both. So the future of work, why are we talking about this at the moment? Well, as we're all aware, in recent months, we've experienced change on a global scale, and the impact has been significant. And though change isn't new, there are positive and negative responses to change, and I've seen both personally and professionally. But also, there's been an emerging culture, an emerging focus on culture and brand, as a more viewed in a more combined way, as opposed to brand being marketing and culture being HR, which is, I think, quite historically how it has been. And a lot more people now are talking about how your brand is to your culture. And culture and the future of work have seen far more attention, particularly in the last 3 months. Interestingly, Google searches went up by something like 120% in April of this year. So people are out there very much looking to understand what this is about. What you can see on the right here is the change curve. Some of you might be familiar with this, and we experience change in different ways. We can go up and down that curve, again, depending on the kind of culture that we have in our organisation, but depending on the kind of people that we are. But you can see that, culture and brand. If we look at culture, it's your people, your passion, your purpose. Brand being your story, your image, and your experience. One of them's more internal, the other focuses on the external to some degree. But we're looking at these, you can see in the cycle there, they're really, really coming together. And so it's important that we understand far more about it. There's been a huge increase in focus on well-being and mental health in the workplace. Relationships and behaviour are often the biggest challenge from some of the things I've experienced. But when we experience such change as we have done in recent months, and it's not just because of the recent changes, I think, well-being and mental health has become far more important to organisations over the last couple of years. And I'm seeing certainly far more interest in people wanting to understand how they work with and manage that for the ongoing safety and development of the people, but importantly as part of their culture. I think we need to and are moving from more of a one-dimensional perspective to a multidimensional perspective to enable resilience and ongoing transition, particularly when macro level a change occurs like it has done recently, through tech, environment, technology. And what this is about is we can't just look at things with one view really anymore. We'll have all experienced in recent months how we've had to become far more open and flexible and learn to adjust, and sometimes we can find that challenging. I've been employed, self-employed, marketer, a strategist, business leader, psychologist. So I've seen change from very different angles and lots of different perspectives. And as I say here, it's always interesting, often challenging, but pays dividends when it's committed to. So today I'm going to talk through quite a whistle-stop tour of quite a few things. Like I said, this is a broad and very deep topic. And I want to talk to you about the challenge in change, the psychology of change, human needs and behavioural drivers, and why understanding those can be helpful, the opportunity for shift in organisational culture, and the paradox of autonomy and belonging, SEO, but not as you know it, a perspective on autonomy in the workplace, so how we might consider employees as franchisees, developing psychological resilience for personal and organisational growth, and protecting company culture. And I'm going to talk about the word protecting later as we go through the presentation. Now, what I'm mindful of is that companies can be in different stages of transition. Some are going through it, I think most are going through it, but some are already farther down the line than others, and change can be different things to different people. And what I want to be really clear about is that all change or all development within organisations, even if it's challenging, doesn't mean that it's bad. And so I want to be really mindful that as we go through this today, you might be on very different journeys personally or within your organisation. And so just be really open, take from this what's most relevant to you. So change is the only constant in life. We all know this, you might have seen this phrase before. So if it's so constant and we're so used to it, why do we find it so hard to embrace? Well, we are wired to protect ourselves. We are wired from the day we were born to protect ourselves. So we often process change as a threat. So at a felt level, we experience fear, we experience anger, ambivalence, but sometimes enthusiasm as well. But on a cognitive level, we can really then push ourselves into a place of looking at resources for change. Am I resourced? Do I have the things around me that I need? Is it only me? Am I on my own in this? Is it happening to anybody else? The limitations, what are the limitations that I'm going to experience because of this? And am I ready? Is it planned or is it imposed? And I think one of the significant things that has happened to us all most recently is that when it's imposed, I mean, change isn't always planned, we can be more aware of certain things. When something is imposed at a macro level, it can be really, really challenging for us. But all of these things are underpinned by, what am I going to lose? And our aversion to loss and the quest for certainty. So why do we need to know? Why is it so important? Well, we want to be safe. Fundamentally, we always want to feel safe, and our brains are wired to want that for us as well. So uncertainty to our brain feels like a threat to life. And when we can't predict an outcome, an alert goes to the brain to pay more attention. So you might have heard the fight, flight and freeze position that we can get into. And the smallest of ambiguity can light up the amygdala in the brain. So it can be anything from a door banging and you're not expecting it, through to somebody not turning up for a meeting even. It can be small to large scale. But preparedness and prediction can become addictive in our attempt to feel and remain safe. The other thing to be aware of is that there's a pleasure in prediction, a pleasure in us being right. And if we think about it, people pay lots of money to feel less uncertain, from fortune tellers to strategic planners, futurologists forecasting. But the reality is it's a best guess based on history. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't be investing in planning and strategy and trying to look forward and understand as best we can. But as we know, it's not possible to have complete certainty or know everything. And I think, March 23rd this year made us really aware of that. So ultimately, our need to know is driven by our need to be safe. And our brains are wired to detect threat based on memory. And what's useful to sometimes remember is that what my brain remembers, for example, based on my history, might be different to yours. Same with anybody else around you. And in an organisational culture, again, that's probably going to be different. So our prediction need drives us to resource and crave information. We're addicted to information. Because we're attached to control, and when we lose control, our brains perceive that we're under so much threat that our behaviour is likely to change. Now, often this happens out of awareness, and this is what can be really valuable when we're thinking about human behaviour within organisations, but also if we're considering change and transition. We can crave information sometimes for the sake of it, again, because it makes us feel safe. We'll go and find out more. Get me another report on that. Let's do a bit more analysis over here. I'll just ask a few more questions there. This is accumulation of safety, and for a reason that we want to avoid any potential loss. What's interesting is it often doesn't make us any more productive or adaptive, but it reduces the sense of uncertainty, which is a feeling. So we invest a lot of resource in managing a feeling because we need that certainty, but we rarely connect it to human condition. We rarely connect it to, I'm feeling really uncertain and unsafe. Oh, that's why I need this information, or that's why I need this to happen, or that's why I need to know this. And we rather refer to it as planning or knowledge. Now, some of it is, but fundamentally what this is about is the feeling of not wanting to be uncertain. So we get all this information, we resource ourselves, we have more things around us to try and make us feel better. But then what? Well, research has shown us that the more we have, the more vulnerable we are. And we are often more focused on what we have to lose rather than what we have to gain. And studies have shown that people often want a significant gain in comparison to the loss. So, for example, we are far more upset about losing £10 than we are feeling excited about finding 10. So I find £10, that's great, but that feeling is nowhere as big or intense as the feeling of loss if I was to lose £10. And so the idea suggests that people have a tendency to stick with what they have unless there is a really, really good reason to switch. And our aversion to loss is a really, really strong emotion. And if we think about change, one of the things about change is that within that, there is always something to give up or to lose. And sometimes some of those things are harder than others, depending on what it is. But the loss aversion is a reflection of a general bias in human psychology. It's what we call status quo bias, and that really makes people resistant to change. So when we think about change, we focus on more what we might lose rather than what we might get. And so in a nutshell, our loss aversion is an important aspect of everyday economic life. And I think it's really important that we're able to acknowledge that, understand that when we're considering our culture and any organisational shift, but also it's really important to be able to recognise it on a personal level and identify with what loss does and means to you. So our default response to change can often be resistance. And I've got here a Chinese finger trap. And I use this with clients and with organisations. And when people talk to me about change or finding difficulty in a shift or loss or need and want something different, I ask them to tell me what's so hard. And what's often the case is that they're resistant to what's happening to them now. And so they do everything they can to try and get out of it. What can I do to avoid the way I'm feeling? What can I do to change this? I'm trying everything. I'm doing everything. I can't bear to feel like this anymore. I don't want this. How can I get out? But actually what this creates in us is a resistance. And you can see here my fingers are stuck because I'm trying so hard to get them out. If I relax, it usually works. I am able to release my fingers. And in being able to do that, that means sitting here, not trying so hard to pull away, go in. And in going inward, there's a release. In the release, despite all that fear, I've now been able to find an element of freedom. Why is something like that really important for us to pay some attention to? Well, I want us to talk about human needs and behavioural drivers now, and why that need to get away feels so important to us. The foundation of psychological safety and resilience are really born out of these two elements, certainly in the work that I do with people and organisations. And I want to share with you what are known as basic psychological hungers and relational needs. So psychological hungers, these are things that we fundamentally desire in order to exist and to be able to live fully. And that is contact, physical contact with others, human connection, recognition, to be noticed, receive attention. So that element of belonging. Incident, so we need challenge, we need things exciting, we need things to be novel and different at times for us. So we need a level of spontaneity in our life. We really require that. Stimulus, sensations, awareness. We need our stimulus. We need stimulus in order to grow. Structure is about time, actually, in this context. And what we mean by that as a hunger is that we want to do with our time what we want to do with it most often. And what we do with our time is we manage it often to avoid pain, to avoid boredom, for example, and to be in charge of our own lives. That's all that gives us that level of what we call time structuring. One of the other things we also hunger is passion. We need to be around, we need to have a level of enthusiasm for life. There needs to be a level of desire in what we're doing. And we sometimes call this, when we work with people, is that element of play. How do we make sure there's an element of play in our lives? Then as we move over and talk about relational needs, this is really important when we think about organisational culture as well, because this is about the relational side and our need to be related to others. That's a need for security, the need to feel validated, affirmed and significant within a relationship. We need to feel like that we matter. The need for acceptance by stable and dependable protective other. Now you can imagine some of these are born from very, very early stages of life, but in the workplace, when we think about the acceptance and stability and dependability, we look at this at an organisation level, but particularly look at this in leadership. The need for mutuality and confirmation of personal experience, the need for self-definition, which is about autonomy, the need to have an impact on another person, the need to have the other initiate, so other people come to us too as much as we go to them to initiate that relationship, and the need to express love. And in the context of organisations, this is not just in organisations but in life as well, this is about the unconditional positive regard for each other, and how able we are to do that. So taking those as important considerations for culture and change, psychological needs are universal, and they are something that people must get satisfied for optimal wellness and performance, so in life and in work. And when there is a deficit, people tend to replace an unmet psychological need with something external. And that's often an overwhelming focus on validation or metrics, as we can feel more vulnerable to loss. So back before, when we're talking about feeling really vulnerable to loss, we'll go outside of ourselves to then do something. And it's often that behaviour that can actually be counterproductive to being able to embrace change. So if we think about change and losses in 2020, we've got some big ones: freedom, domestic captivity, reduced access to resources, the things around us, an always on mentality in some way with work. Though we've had the pleasure of, or the fortunate circumstance of having great technology, there's an always on element to that sometimes, and it can be quite difficult for people to be on tech all the time. Human connection has been the biggest loss, as most people talk to me about. But job security, salaries, budget priorities, social life, play, education, homeschooling, workplace. And I pointed this out earlier, but this has been done on a macro level. There's been no choice about this. You've just been given it, and not just one or two things, but several. So it's really important to recognise that this isn't easy. And therefore within that, it's very ordinary, very okay to have the responses that we may be having to it at this moment in time. So what's the antidote? Well, in the context of loss and considering those psychological hungers and those basic relational needs, emotional regulation is really important. And when we think about emotional regulation, I talk with people on a one-to-one basis a lot about this, but I talk about it at group level too. But it's about being able to take a different perspective, and able to do that, we need to be autonomous. And when I talk about autonomy, people can often think about autonomy about being alone, which it isn't at all. This isn't about being alone and being without the other. This is having a very strong sense of self and feeling fully able to work with all your resources in order to live and be in the world in an okay place. So with that in mind, I want to talk about the history of organisational culture and hierarchy, because this is quite interesting when we think about autonomy. And I want to talk to you about the psychological structure of hierarchy and share with you a model that I work with. And it's called the pack model, and it's a structure of personality. And I work with this with individuals, so within themselves, but I also work in an organisational structure perspective as well. Well, this identifies 3 ego states that we live and transact from with others. And it's called the pack model because it stands for parents, adults, and child. And if you look at the diagram on the left, which is my left here, you can see that what we have is the arrows in the middle going from A to A. They're transacting what we call an adult to adult way. Over to the right, you can see that the transaction there is from parent to child and child to parent. Now, historically, hierarchy in organisations can often have the structure culturally on the right. Now, that's not that it's wrong. It's quite ordinary, given hierarchy, that there might be this parent to child way of communicating, transacting with others. What autonomy can really help us understand is that it might be far more healthy for us to consider a more adult-to-adult relationship, whether that be through our hierarchical structure and with each other. And it can be really, really helpful when we think about wanting to embrace autonomy within individuals, but also help enable a positive response to change. So there's a real cultural shift potentially with this, and different organisations, depending upon where they are on their journey and within their culture, are receptive to it. Others find it quite challenging, but it can just be a principle or an intention. It doesn't need to be something that's, you know, initiated or implemented imminently. It can be about mindset. But the cultural shift here, it can be quite controversial at times, but it's about the collapse of power. And that does not mean that that's not leadership. It doesn't mean that there isn't structure. And it doesn't mean that we, you know, relinquish all the processes and structure that are required to run an organisation. But what it does mean is that we're far more willing to be open and more open and therefore resilient to change. And what you can see here is that there's the adult to adult example. And what I talk about with people is this strengthening of an adult ego state, whether it be within you or within your organisation. And that's about behaviours, thoughts and feelings which are direct responses to the here and now and allow us that flexibility, rather than historical memories based on change that we find very difficult sometimes and that we're predisposed to wanting to stop and jolt ourselves with. This really helps us be far more flexible and responsive. So the nature of hierarchy in traditional organisational culture can be, not always, but can be prohibitive sometimes to transacting and behaving in an adult-to-adult way, which therefore invites thoughts, feelings and behaviours that may not be conducive with autonomy, self-efficacy and positive response to change. Not always. This isn't a black or white situation, and it really depends on where you are now in your organisational culture. What you can see here is what we call the OK Corral chart, and this is about what we call life positions. And what you can see here is you've got I'm okay, you're okay, I'm okay, you're not okay, I'm okay, you're not okay, and then at the top there we've got I can't see my screen and I should know this anyway, is I think it's I'm okay, I'm not okay, you're okay. But what you can see here is that these life positions are really important and helpful when we consider that adult ego state scenario that I talked about before. And I talked about the collapse of power. So the I'm not okay, you are okay in that top left-hand corner. It's that one down position that we can sometimes experience. And it's not just in hierarchy, it can be in lots of different relationships. But what we're trying to work with here is how can we as best as we can, and often, because it's not all the time, be in the I'm okay, you're okay place within our culture. And as we can see here, because my attitude affects my behaviour affects your attitude, which affects your behaviour, and then that affects my attitude. So autonomy is supporting ourselves through change. So I talked about SEO earlier, not as you might know it. This isn't about search engine optimization. This is about self, environment, and other. And it's a tool that we can use and work with individually and collectively within our organisations. And this is about what resources are we using coming from the adult and a more autonomous place to help us manage and respond to change. So the self, we can think about self-awareness. Do we really know who we are and why? I often work with people on self-awareness because often this is the place where the more we get to know ourselves, the more opportunity that we have to be able to influence things more positively. Esteem and self-acceptance, inner critics can be hugely intense and they can often really, really destabilise us. Self-compassion and emotional regulation. How can we take responsibility for ourselves to be more open and receptive? How do we take care of our physical well-being? Our mental well-being, what stimulates you and what's important to keep you mentally well? How do you nourish your mind and challenge your biases? So keep inviting alternative perspectives so that you don't end up in that kind of rigid place. The importance of rest. How are you really looking after yourself and being still? How do you educate yourself? What knowledge are you bringing in? And it's all about your psychological diet. What inbound do you have that really helps you that in terms of looking after yourself? Capacity and boundaries. Really know your limits. One of the things that I've been listening to in some research I've been doing over recent weeks has been about, for example, how people have felt because they're remote working. There's this pressure to be far more responsive, i.e. if I don't pick up the phone when my boss rings, I'm really worried that they're going to think I'm not doing anything. And so what's really important here is to understand what capacity we have, but what boundaries that we need to sometimes put in place within those relationships around us. Our environment, what the E stands for, and this is looking at how do we look to our environment then for support? Do we want to be inside? Do we want to be outside? What does the office give us? What does home give us? Do we like quiet, noise? Do we need to be active? Do we need to be calm? Technology, accessibility, capability. If we think about the importance now of people remote working, have they got what they need around them to help them with that psychological safety and that level of autonomy? Online insight and knowledge. There's so much available to us online. I know I talked about information craving before, and I think it's, again, once that becomes more aware, you can then manage it differently. But what resources and tools are out there in your environment that might help? Gym, fitness, how you're looking after yourself physically. I touched on that before, but is there something within the environment that could be helpful toward you? Breakout space. Breakout space was something that's been a big topic in organisations for a long time, and I know a lot more people have been investing in these kind of cool hangout areas, whether it be beanbags, pool tables, whatever it is. But sometimes those breakout spaces are there for people to just go and escape, and again, within the environment, that can be really helpful. Other things, sounds, music, activity. But this is about what have you got out there and around you that can help you feel more connected and psychologically safe. In terms of the other, this is how we lean on other people around us for support. You can look at leadership and management. Are there colleagues that you can go to? Are there friends, family, social groups, learning, peers, mentors, coaching, therapy? The importance here is being able to ask for help and really be able to lean into your vulnerability. So an example of autonomy, belonging, and SEO in action. And I was trying to think of a good metaphor for this, because sometimes it's hard when we just think about it in the context of just our organisation, and we can particularly feel clouded when there's been so much going on as there has recently. And I came to Ziggy Stardust and begun to watch more documentaries actually on Bowie. And what really drew me to this as an example was that what he wanted to do here was really have or express his individuality and volition, but it was enabled through the collective. And when I talked earlier about us embracing and considering autonomy, and almost the paradox really of autonomy and belonging, is this isn't about being alone, this isn't about being completely separate, but it's having a healthy level of separateness, which often comes from where we belong. And what he was able to do, Ziggy, with the spiders from Mars, was create and have exactly that. And it gave him permission to fully express himself creatively. It actually enhanced his identity. They made a show, not just music. You talked about environment it wasn't just music anymore. They created shows. But he needed them to grow and to perform. But as we know, he didn't stay that way and didn't stay that way forever because he couldn't, because he began to lose who he was. And this is why balance is so important. So how do we go from Bowie to the boardroom? And I touched on the paradox of belonging, and it's this, it's about structure and freedom, and how do we get that? And I think of a great talk I heard once on, I think it was a TEDx radio talk from a conductor, Charles Hazelwood. And, music, I've got some pictures here of an orchestra and a conductor. And the point here is that, you know, all of those people playing those instruments are there on their own. What combines them is the sheets of music and the conductor. And it's only as they play together do they produce something that is wonderful. And I then, you know, bringing that back to business, I was thinking, okay, well, the franchisee have a mentality of togetherness, but separateness. And it really made me think about a perspective that we might be able to take when we think about the world that we're living in at the moment. So if we look at the franchise, well, it's a strategy for growth. Fundamentally, that's why franchise and franchisees grow in the way that they do. You know, but they have got a product, a business model, an IP, a brand, culture, training, processes. They already exist. Now, in all cases, the upfront investment from an individual is how that gets started. So it's a cash investment. But franchisees run that business within the franchise agreement and guidelines, but they are given complete autonomy in delivering the output. And there is a franchise to lean upon. There's fellow franchisees. I did a bit of research and chatted to a couple of franchisees in the last month who shared their experience with me and talked about the fact, well, they are trusted and empowered, and ultimately it's their responsibility. And it just got me thinking again about this autonomy within organisations. And if we think about the concept within an organisation, you know, what this isn't about is a literal translation and saying, right, turn everybody into a franchisee. Not at all. But it's about having a mindset that allows us to think about togetherness and separateness in a healthy way. You know, for organisations, a strategy for growth. All organisations are looking to grow and change most of the time. Your organisation is fully set up, just like a franchise is. The investment here is the biggest difference because it's two-way, and it's the individual that's coming to choose to work for the company or vice versa. So it's a relational commitment as the investment, which is why the psychological element of this is so important. You've got the employment contract, so that is just like having your franchise agreement. You've got the organisation and the collectives to belong to. You have peers, you have colleagues, you've got leadership, you've got management. But fundamentally, you have you. And I think what's really important here is that individuals and organisations need to take responsibility for change. It isn't just the organisation's responsibility. All of us within the roles that we have and the organisations we are in have to take responsibility for ourselves as well. And when we're able to do that, what this really helps with is empowerment and motivation. And when we feel empowered to do something, we are far more likely to get some joy from doing it. Now, there are types of motivation, and I talk about types of motivation because sometimes in organisations, or whether it be with leaders or with employees themselves, I hear things like, "Oh, they lack motivation," or "We need more motivation." And I like to think of this as types rather than amounts because I think it's far more helpful. You know, I go back to earlier comment that I made around seeking when we have unmet needs, we seek validation externally, and often this can be in the form of metric as well. So there are two types of motivation. There's autonomous motivation, which is a full sense of willingness and volition and choice. And there's controlled motivation. So doing something because you feel obliged, demanded to do it, or to avoid punishment or to be rewarded. And this concept came from two psychologists called DC and Ryan some years ago, but it was really, really valuable in terms of helping organisational culture. Now, often we can, not always, but I listen to people talk about, I'll just pop back there, controlled motivation being something that people feel that they experience more. I think there is more likely to be a balance, but it's interesting how people tend to notice the latter. There are two types of autonomous motivation. Intrinsic motivation, and this is something that's really interesting and enjoyable to you, so you do it for the sake of it. There's then extrinsic motivation. Now, this is driven by external rewards, so it's not like the controlled motivation, but it still has a driver. So driven by external rewards, but the point here and the difference is that when the person can understand the value of something and then integrate it as part of themselves. So we think about company goals, objectives, for example. You know, people can then own it as their own and identify with it. And when they're able to do that, that gives a far greater level of autonomous motivation than it just is controlled and responsive. So when we think about that in the context of change, I was thinking quite a bit about, from conversations I've been having with the guys at Waracle, but the different types of industries and organisations I've been working with. I got far more fascinated by the language of Agile and sprints. And I was thinking, wow, I think there's really something in this culturally, not just in terms of technology change, but in terms of how we view ourselves as people. And positive response to change requires agility. And agility comes from autonomy. And autonomy is built on trust. And which those both come from empowerment and psychological safety. And if we think about where, Agile, originated from, this was all about, I think it was lean principles way back when, which was, empowering people on the front line to make decisions. What that required hugely was an element of trust. Now, it was about efficiency and effectiveness to a degree. That was the output. But really what this gave was people far more autonomy in what they were doing. So when we think about that in the context of the future of workplace culture, for me, I think the key things to be thinking about are this: agility, autonomy, and psychological resilience. I think if you're able to consider those as a platform for what you want to do next, they can be a really great starting point. And for me, what this gives is, it's a mindset again, but it's a passion for learning rather than hunger for approval. And again, the hunger for approval is why we seek that validation so much, why we want more information, why are we so averse to loss. If we were far more open and receptive and less threatened by change and more willing to learn through it, then we'd be far more responsive to it and able to influence things positively. So considerations for you. So the release of the Chinese finger trap. So at an organisational level, wow, long live the office is what I can say, because I know that we are going through phases of transition at the moment, and I have no crystal ball. I've no idea what the future really holds in most aspects. But what I do know, and what I've listened to from people I've been speaking to in recent months, from those that I've been working with since all the changes in March, is that everybody wants human connection again. The likelihood there's going to be a hybrid of remote office and working. So how are you going to think about that? A culture for growth, the pack model could be a great thing to consider for you. Are you wanting to consider how your hierarchy is currently managed? Sharon touched on before, I made a note, but actually remote has moved us, you didn't use these words, but it sounds like greater equality. I think what's one thing that recent events have done or helps to experience is far more greater levels of balance and equality. SEO, again, not as itself, environment optimization. As an organisation, what are you doing to help individuals with that, but also set something up as an organisation? What's your transformation agenda? Is there a clarity around that? Psychoeducation, is that something that you might want to consider? And psychoeducation is as it sounds, it's educating your people, your leadership team, with psychological tools to help and enhance them, for example, with autonomy, and therefore the ability to respond to change differently. Collaborate with those already doing it. There are organisations out there that have been doing this, some of this remote working, some of this hybrid approach for a long, long time. Sharon talked earlier about some of the things they've been doing at Waracle for a while. If you're not already doing some of these things, don't be afraid to go and collaborate with somebody else and ask, back to that learning point. And consider, are you going to be a culture of prevention and intervention as well as remedial? And I talk about this in my work in particular, because sometimes people will come to me when things have got really, really, really bad. And that's okay. I can work with people in a remedial fashion. But what I love being able to do is to be able to work with people in a prevention and intervention way as well. So it's not about predicting, but it's about setting things up to avoid things becoming so difficult at a later date because we were so resistant to change. At an individual level, be present, open up, allow all the things you're thinking and feeling right now about what's been going on for you. I know it's absolutely okay, but create space for that. Don't avoid it and try and get yourself in this trap. Do what matters to you. We forget what's important to us, and I think having a healthy reminder of that can be really helpful. Again, the SEO model here: self, environment, other. What resources do you have yourself? What do you have in your environment? Who do you have around you that you can lean upon? Again, psychoeducation, whether you know, things you can start reading, TED Talks you can watch. There's loads and loads of things out there, but sometimes these can really help us with self-awareness. What is your psychological diet? What are you feeding yourself with? Who are you hanging around with? What are you listening to? Really think about that and how helpful it is. Be open, be receptive. Take complete responsibility for yourself. That doesn't mean don't lean on others. That's not a contradiction to the other things I've said. But take the adult ego state and take complete responsibility for you in your life. Try as often as possible to come from the I'm okay, you're okay position. This is really, really helpful in that relationship building. From a leadership point of view, I think autonomous motivation is something that's worth thinking about, that intrinsic, extrinsic example I gave earlier. Adult to adult culture and communication, again, psychoeducation. You know, you can't pour from an empty cup. If you're responsible for people and for others, you need to take care of yourself as well first. Again, the SEO model can be helpful there. But this balance between hierarchy and agile, so, you know, the power or leadership mentality. Self-care, I've touched upon that. And again, prevention and intervention. What can you kind of see maybe coming down the line, or what might you want to do to prevent or intervene things becoming far more difficult at a later stage? So some key thoughts. These are some of my views, some of the things that I've seen and found helpful with people. A culture of autonomy. And how can you find the balance of extrinsic and intrinsic motivation? SEO, you need to be supporting people's basic psychological needs. And we might not have seen that as something important for the agenda historically. It isn't just about mental health and well-being and waiting until something gets so bad that you start to help people. Do it from the off. And if behaviour is your biggest challenge, you know, how willing are you to invest in the psychology of your business and your people, starting at the top? Not to mention the C word. I kind of wanted to end here on the importance of language. And I've referred to what's happened in recent months, but I've purposely chosen not to indulge too much in any of the language that we're so used to hearing around it. Pandemic, seismic, unprecedented. Not to discount at all the severity of what's been going on for us, but language is really important psychologically. And also, one of the things I feel quite passionate about is, you know, people, culture, and the future of the workplace was always important. And COVID-19 simply made sure that we knew about it. So what's this about now? Well, it's about now, as in the present. It's not just about what are we going to do after this. Be in it now, embrace it now. And your ability to embrace a digital future and psychological development of you and your organisation is what will help, I believe, carry you through. So I'm going to leave you some questions to take away that you might find interesting, worth pondering over. But it's, does your culture facilitate agility through autonomy, empowerment, and psychological safety? Just maybe have a think about that. Are you protecting for control or protecting psychological safety to enable growth? I did this with protecting earlier on in the presentation, because what's interesting sometimes about the word protecting is it about like control and loss? We touched on loss before. So it's just something to have a think about. We talk about protecting culture. How much of it's to do with this, or how much of it actually is about there's some great stuff that you've got there and it's about nurturing really and harnessing it. And what's your SEO strategy? Again, not search engine optimization and getting those Google rankings up. As an individual and as an organisation, maybe grab a piece of paper, have a think about it, or get in touch with me, and I have a model you can have a look at. But take those away, see what you think, and just see if it creates some more curiosity for you. And if you're ready to explore any of those at some time, what you'll have seen from some of what I've done today is I look at psychology for enablers, enablers for agility and change, executive coaching and psychological development, psychoeducation I talk about a lot, and the more people get to know, it certainly helps from what I experience, corporate well-being and mental health, and I'm also an integrative psychotherapist and ACT practitioner. So I hope you found some of that useful, and yeah, open to any questions.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Joanna. I hope it's been interesting to everyone. It is most definitely a very different topic for us to use, but it is our life. And so I desperately tried as well not to use the actual words, but I probably slipped up a couple of times. But anyway, Joanna, we've got a couple of questions, because just before we finish up, there's a number around what the office will look like. So I'll come back to those in a minute, but there's just a couple of others that we mentioned. Do you think that building a workplace culture will be more difficult for startups than maintaining a culture in established organizations if we move to more of a remote model of work?
I thought it might have been easier for startups, if I've understood the question. I think what I'm listening to there is that perhaps because of something that's less established, what are you holding on to? And I think I take that as the gift, in that because there isn't something there, what can you do? I would support a view that it can be harder to do that remotely, but I think given some of the relaxation that we have now, there's no reason with commitment and the right support that something couldn't be developed, but it might just take a little bit more time.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think if you're starting from scratch, then you can just build it to whatever you want it to be.
There's no legacy system.
Yeah, so based on that, here's an interesting question. Is it possible to actually change a workplace culture? Having worked in really toxic and political workplaces, is it reasonable to think that an organization that is, say, 25 to 30 years old or older can shift its mode of operation when it comes to hierarchy, motivations, and behaviors?
Okay, time to try and break that one down. So I think it sounds like somebody's talking about sort of toxic workplace cultures, and again, a legacy of something that's not been conducive to change. Yeah, it's really hard. I think the older anything is, or the more established something is, it can be harder to break down. But I bring this back often to leadership, because if the leadership are unwilling to change and don't see the problem, being really frank, it's difficult, almost impossible to change a culture. So I'm just trying to make sure I cover the different things that question asked, Sharon. So I think in terms of the legacy of something, I think it's difficult. Can it be done? It is possible, but it requires real work and commitment. And I don't think it's something that, again, the problem we have sometimes in organisations, people talk to me wanting to make a change, but they want it quickly. And talk about quickly can be a year. Just because you now have some budget to invest in or want to develop culture, you can't just change something in a year. It could take years. But it really does need to start at the top. And I think there needs to be a willingness and acceptance to understand it can take a significant amount of time to do that. But I think get the right support and work with the right people, but fundamentally at board level have a willingness to do that. And there might be a possibility it can be done.
Yeah, I think we've seen quite a few organisations who have had very traditional 9-to-5 models and worked in that kind of way for decades. And I think one of the things that you and I have talked about before is really focusing on, there's a big difference now of managing performance rather than managing time. And that's, personally, I think it's a really critical thing in terms of this environment that we're in, is based on output of what we need someone to do, as opposed to how long they're working, and what hours they're working, and whether it's a 9-to-5, because it's quite unreasonable at the moment given other pressures that are going on. So I think for me, what's critical is the refocus of, you're looking at performance rather than time, or not simply time. And I think that's a really key one.
And quality of output, quality of output doesn't just come from time. It often comes from people feeling good about what they're doing. So
we've probably only got a couple more. So we've got the big chestnut that we know will come up, and has come up for all of us in the last few few months is, do we ever think we will be back in the office 9 to 5 as we're used to in the past? And I know probably both of us can have a stab at that with our crystal balls. You go first.
Yeah, there'll be a need, unless there is, significant, obviously, health or legal requirements to prevent this happening. I think we need to be back being together as soon as we can. But the reality, I believe, where I sit at the moment, and in my opinion, that there's going to be a hybrid way of doing this, maybe for some time. And so maybe that means that you're remote working some days a week, you're in an office for other days of the week. But I think there needs to be an investment in how you might create a hybrid model for your employees and for the organisation. How long it'll go on for, we will see. I think it will all depend economically as well of how much commercial property can remain half empty if that's the case. So I think there's lots of things to consider, but I think from a people and culture point of view, we can't be doing everything remotely if we're going to grow.
Okay, great. I'm of the same opinion. We've had a couple of chats with larger tech companies as well, and though it's easy for us, or easier for us, I do think there will be a hybrid going back. Though I think in general, I don't think the change has been long enough. I think it's been quite dramatic for a lot of organizations, but not necessarily long enough for it to become embedded. And I think very traditional organizations, perhaps, possibly generalizing now, but legal firms or even some financial institutions and the like might find it difficult not to go back to the model that they were in. I think for us, what we're trying to look at is what is the goodness that has come out of this for us, of which there has been some things, and how can we keep that going within the organization when we ultimately will head back to some kind of hybrid model, but it won't be what we had before.
Yeah, and I think the thing is, don't forget what you've learned as everybody individually and as an organisation. I think there's been a lot of things we will have learned in recent months, and let's not lose sight of that just because what we had feels familiar.
Okay, right. Well, we're right on time, and so I'm afraid that we've cut quite a few of the questions, but what we can potentially do is try and get some answers back out to you anyway for any of them. You know how to get in touch with us. I hope it's been useful. It is a break from the norm for us, but definitely one that we wanted to explore because it's quite important to how we operate as an organization. So we have another one of these coming up, slightly different topic, on the 13th of August. And this one's important for different reasons at the moment, because there's a lot of graduates and school leavers who are leaving under quite different circumstances than what they expected to, not necessarily with a piece of paper in their hand that they expected to either. So what we're doing on the 13th of August in conjunction with People's Postcode Lottery is a topic around how to plan or how a career in tech and how the steps you might take to get there. And so some of the people speaking on that will be talking about their paths, which were not always normal paths to get a career in technology. So we'd love to see you along. Please give us any feedback. We'll be sending some information out for that, and hope you've enjoyed the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.